Peace, family. I'm Brother C.B. Powell, First Assistant President General of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, parent body. The Universal Negro Improvement Association is both an institution and a movement dedicated to the social, educational, economic, political, and cultural uplift of all peoples of African descent. Founded in 1914 by the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey, we champion racial pride, self-reliance, and universal African nationalism. You've heard the famous quote of Mr. Garvey, "Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will." Granted, the year is 2024, and we've heard plenty of variations of "say it loud, I'm black and I'm proud," but let's focus in on the context upon which the statement, "Up, you mighty race, you can accomplish what you will," arises. Mr. Garvey lived in a time when black racial cowardice was considered good Christian moral virtue. You may find that this is still popular today. He lived in a time when the scramble for Africa was still in full swing. In fact, black subjugation was so normalized that the very notion that black as a race being mighty was considered the talk of an insane man. As a young man, Mr. Garvey was a publisher, journalist, orator, dock worker, trade unionist, a man of many trades really. And as he traveled by sea to places like Panama, Costa Rica, Honduras, Ecuador, Colombia, Venezuela, London, and other European countries, he'd look out at the waters, and from the seas and oceans he would hear a haunting whisper asking him, "Where is the black man's government? Where is his king and his kingdom? Where is his president, his ambassador, his country, his men of big affairs?" Now, family, please remember to see this from Mr. Garvey's perspective and not in our 2020 hindsight. For certain, African national sovereignty has skyrocketed over the past 110 years. For example, we see Burkina Faso nationalizing their gold mining industry as recently as a few months ago under the leadership of Ibrahim Traore. But at the time, this was a question which went largely without answer. So as he would enter and exit different ports, as he waited for the ships to dock, as he traversed the oceans and seas, so persistent, so nagging were these whispers to Mr. Garvey's ears that he thought. Then a light bulb lit above his head and he said, "I know what I'll do. I will help to make them." Now, this eventually leads us to the conversation of self-reliance, but the point is that there is no racial self-reliance without racial self-esteem. In Mr. Garvey's own words, if you have no confidence in self, you are twice defeated in the race of life. With confidence, you have won even before you started. How do we arrive at this? Well, for a clearer path to the future, Mr. Garvey supported this crazy notion of racial pride by establishing it upon our true history as a people. In his own words, history is the landmark by which we are directed into the true course of life. The history of a movement, the history of a nation, the history of a race is the guidepost of that movement's destiny, that nation's destiny, that race's destiny. It's almost become a proverb that our history has been miseducated to us by those who sustain their dominance over us through our own ignorance of self, our own self-alienization. But knowledge is the key to open the door to ourselves, but a key merely opens a door, it doesn't walk you through the door. See, knowledge, even knowledge of self, without application is not movement, just as faith without works is dead. Mr. Garvey believed that true reform, true liberation requires action. Our knowledge of ourselves and our history eventually must be manifest in our environments. Knowledge merely reboots and upgrades our minds to notice the power that is already within ourselves, but action, it manifests that knowledge into this realm of flesh and blood and brick and mortar. It makes it real, tangible, quantifiable, measurable. So, the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey knew that with racial pride that comes from the knowledge of self, we evolved from being products of our environments to now having the power to shift, almost terraform our environments. In fact, Mr. Garvey himself says that this is the day of racial activity, when each and every group of this great human family must exercise its own initiatives and influence in its own protection. Therefore, Negroes should be more determined today than they have ever been, because the mighty forces of the world are operating against non-organized groups of peoples who are not ambitious enough to protect their own interests. To have self-esteem as a race, racial pride, is to have self-reliance as a race, racial autonomy. But self-reliance is a daily initiative driven by action. So let's talk a little bit more about self-reliance. Mr. Garvey once said that action, self-reliance, the vision of self, and the future have been the only means by which the oppressed have seen and realized the light of their own freedom. I want to be clear. Racial pride is not self-sustaining. It does not exist within a vacuum. In fact, racial pride and racial self-reliance go hand in hand. It is not one or the other. It is not one and then the other. The two hands wash each other. They pour into each other, each time multiplying the other's returns. When I believe that I can, then I do. When I do, this reinforces my belief that I can. When I believe that I can't, I don't do. I wait for others to do for me. Certainly this is relevant on an individual level, but pan out, if you would, to the broader context of us as a people. Both racial pride and racial self-reliance must work in tandem for either of them to have any real effect on a person, let alone on billions of people such as us. With even a basic understanding of the psychological effects of slavery and colonialism, it's pretty easy to notice the peculiar Stockholm syndrome, that is, the oppressed love for their oppressor that took a hold in our people. We relied on them for food, housing, employment, albeit involuntary, even so-called education. Conditioned to be a permanent worker class, a permanent debtor class. Naturally, this led to bridled brilliance. It stunted our imagination of all that we could accomplish as a race on our own. And so here we are. But Mr. Garvey believed that this conditioning was rooted in a mass inferiority complex, which, after compounding racial pride and racial self-reliance, we could cure this complex and indeed accomplish what we will. And we are more than enough. Mr. Garvey knew that even when no one else did. And this is the spirit of this great association. To believe that a people can, racial pride, is to do whatever that people will to do, self-reliance, autonomy. You know, one of my favorite songs is by James Brown. It's called I Don't Want Nobody to Give Me Nothing. He said, open up the door and I'll get it myself. We got talents we could use on our side of town. Let's put our heads together and build it up from the ground. I'm not going to tell you what to do. I'm not going to raise a fuss. But before you make another move, let's start by taking care of us. I think Mr. Garvey would have liked that song. We have the brilliance. We have the tools. We have the moral authority, the divine right, the divine responsibility to assert ourselves as men and women fully capable of building our own communities, policing our own neighborhoods, growing our own food, building and sustaining our own grocery stores, banks and credit unions, hospitals and health clinics, commercial shipping and trucking enterprises, museums, building our own schools, colleges and universities, and dare I say, even governing ourselves locally, nationally, serving our own agenda. Would you look at that? Many of you are living proof of how true that is. Lord knows right now I'm talking to some brilliant brothers and sisters, and not just those of us with degrees. From the streets to the C-suites, we are more than enough. Now, please understand, individually, power lies within me, just as it lies within you, but the true power lies within we. Each digit functions just fine without the other individually. I don't need to ask my thumb for permission to move my pinky. What gives the pinky my ability to do this, though? Well, it, like the other digits, grows out of the same palm. But when those fingers tightly come together in solidarity based upon that palm, they gain a new type of power. The power to generate force. And I think it's time to raise this fist again. What do you think? And think more broadly than just force in a combative sense. Think economic force and thus political force, the shifting of policies and markets in directions suited to our collective benefit. That way we as a people are no longer pawns in this never-ending chess match between political parties that serenade us with platitudes during their administration, and then they suck up to us in election season with a greatest hits album worth of excuses. The cultural force of good, scientific innovation, art, diplomacy. We join other races at the negotiation table as true power brokers on the world stage. This was the vision of Marcus Mosiah Garvey. This was Garveyism. But this is the kind of reshaping of the world in our image that can only be brought about by self-reliance. But we cannot stop at individual self-reliance, and that seems to be the temptation for many of us, sadly. We can branch in our own directions, by all means. By ourselves as individuals, be proud of your ethnicity, your tribe, your gender, your nationality, your religion. Unity does not require getting in the way of any of that. Don't conflate unity and uniformity, but never forget that we lose our collective power to influence our environment when we disconnect from the roots that unite us. So self-reliance for the Black collective is merely the next logical step for our survival as a people on this earth. We don't have everything we need, but we have everyone we need. Together, we are more than enough. Knowing this, Mr. Garvey knew that we must take it upon ourselves to create the future that our children will inherit because we are accountable to our descendants. And speaking of the future, I mentioned universal African nationalism because I, like Garvey, believe that it is the next natural, logical progression for any people that have matured enough to learn to share ambition with each other, especially when they are more alike than they are different. In fact, this is that ambition at its highest form. Let me explain this by first reviewing how exactly we got to this point. When we as individuals have pride in our race, we love ourselves in part for our race. So naturally, we love the reflections of ourselves, each other. This creates a culture of racial pride, dignity, and thus cooperation. A culture of racial pride and dignity working jointly with a culture of action and fierce self-reliance brings material abundance, enabling us to solve the problems in our own respective communities. Unemployment, lack of access to capital for housing and commerce, lack of access to affordable health care, lack of affordable healthy food choices, lack of educational resources for our children that promote and reinforce that culture of self-love, and so on. When these problems are solved in our immediate communities, naturally, we will look for other problems to solve. The human brain is always looking for new puzzles and problems and equations to solve. This is when we look to strengthen the roots from which we all sprout, the continent of Africa. Universal African nationalism is the belief that all peoples of African descent should work together toward a common future based upon a common heritage. That common future is a united Africa, commercially, culturally, and politically cooperative. Inevitably, I as a Black American, or FBA, ADOS, whatever you want to call it, will in some ways see from a different perspective than, say, a continental African or a Central American Negro or a brother or sister from the Caribbean. But universal African nationalism believes that those differences, though seemingly great on their own, are small compared to what we have in common in the grander scheme of power politics on this world. That commonality isn't just the soulfulness, it's not just the rhythm of Black folks all over the world that we have in common. It starts there, But more profoundly, that commonality is the struggle for liberation against non-black systems and powers that thrive upon our division, and thus not only our economic and political impoverishment, but also our spiritual. Again, universal African nationalism believes that those differences, though great on their own, are small compared to what we have in common in the grander scheme of global power politics, and certainly small compared to what we have to gain by uniting. It may be difficult for some to focus on grand scheme politics because the problems in their immediate tribes are more urgent, and that's to be expected. The problems 2 doors down will obviously be more urgent and more time sensitive to you than the problems across the ocean. Again, this is to be expected, this is to be even understood. But it is not to be accepted, at least not permanently. Universal African nationalism is the highest ambition of Garveyism. Step by step, we improve ourselves individually, then with each other, then with our neighboring black communities locally, nationally, and then internationally. But all of this is to strengthen the roots from which we come. The continent of Africa is the root, and we are the branches. When we nurture our roots in our native soil, we extend the reach of our branches. Some of you are likely asking, so Brother CB, explain to me how exactly help in Africa is going to help me in my community. I'm from Trenton, New Jersey, right? So how's this going to help me in Jersey or in New York or Cleveland or Chicago or DC? Well, rhetorical or not, I think that's a great question. Let me explain. The quest for a united African continent is not a new concept. This was always the ambition of Marcus Garvey and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. In fact, our first international convention consisted of delegates from all over the world to do just that. We worked with the Liberian government to facilitate a program that would allow our brightest minds to repatriate to Liberia, work with the Liberian government to develop thriving communities, and to continue to work toward a United States of Africa federation situation. There's a lot to the story, but the long and short of it is that various Western governments and multinational corporations like the Goodyear Rubber Company interfered and ultimately effectively sabotaged our endeavors. Today, the Universal Negro Improvement Association worked closely with the African Union to complete this operation. In fact, our second Assistant President General, John Jackson, he has been working directly with the African Union for over 2 decades. We title this endeavor Agenda 2063. In short, it is the master plan to transform the African continent into the global economic, political, cultural powerhouse that its natural and human resources qualified to be. There are 15 flagship projects of Agenda 2063, but here are 5 of them, and you can read up on the rest of them by going to the link at the bottom of the screen. Number 1, establishment of the African continental financial institutions to accelerate growth and investment. Number 2, the African Passport and Free Movement of People project to remove restrictions on Africans' ability to travel, work, and live within their own continent. Number 3, formulation of an African commodity strategy. Africa must use its own raw materials to ensure its own economic development. Number 4, the integrated high-speed train network. That's to bind the country together just like the American railroad system did. And this will make the supply chain more efficient, making us more commercially viable in the international markets. And number 5, establishment of a single African air transport market. This exists to create a single unified air transport market in Africa as an impetus to the continent's economic integration and growth agenda. Now, all this obviously sounds promising, but cui bono? Who benefits from this? Well, the stakeholders of Agenda 2063 are classified into 6 regions: North, South, East, Central, and West Africa. And then there's the 6th region, the African diaspora. That's me and that's many of you. And we are the heirs to the promise of Agenda 2063. I want you to just think about the possibilities that we of the diaspora stand to gain. The cultural enrichment, yes. The social bonding. The foreign investment opportunities. The continent of Africa is fertile ground for all of us in the diaspora to use the skills that we've obtained across the world and to reap the benefits, and then continuously sow parts of those benefits directly back into the socioeconomic and political fabric of the continent. This is the master plan, and we are officially recognized as heirs to its achievements. This is what the Universal Negro Improvement Association is working on every single day. This is grand strategy Garveyism. This agenda was built upon the vision of independent African countries within the African Union and the Universal Negro Improvement Association. This was the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey's dream, that through a united federation of Africa, we would seat ourselves at the global negotiation table of great power politics, the same as all other great peoples of the world, or make our own table. This has both collective and individual benefits for all of us who comprise the 6 regions. This is our inheritance. And through the Universal Negro Improvement Association, we will take our inheritance. Ashe. We've talked about several things. Mr. Garvey, UNIA, racial pride, racial self-determination, universal African nationalism, Agenda 2063. I want to close by telling you a true story and then giving you a call to action. Our story begins with a man named Isaiah Emanuel Morter. And this was a great man, an industrious man, a self-made man. Born in 1860, he made his fortune in his homeland of Belize, farming coconuts and bananas. He owned many plantations and even a private island. In fact, he was Belize's first African millionaire, even though it was under British colonial rule at the time. Even today, there's a statue of him in the center of Belize City. You can check it out yourself. For health reasons, he came to the United States in the early 1920s, where he stayed in the home of our very own Mr. Garvey. They had befriended already during Mr. Garvey's many trips to Belize, but during his treatment in New York, where he stayed with Mr. Garvey for several weeks, he was so moved and so inspired by the audacity of the UNIA and the Marcus Garvey to dream that he decided to include the UNIA in his will. So that upon his death, nearly 2/3 of his entire fortune would go to the Universal Negro Improvement for, quote, African redemption. This was the first major endowment given to the association. At the 1922 International Convention, Morter was awarded a UNIA knighthood and the title Knight Commander Distinguished Service Order of Ethiopia for his faithful and distinguished service to the Negro race. Well, our brother joined the ancestors in April of 1924. We honored him as a man, as an African, and as a Garveyite. But meanwhile, as we were still processing the loss of our brother, there was a legal battle waged against the UNIA by the courts both here and in Belize, which again was still under British colonial rule. They knew that an organization like the UNIA inheriting such wealth and using it to uplift the race and the continent of Africa would shift the power dynamics of the status quo. Marcus Garvey made several trips to Belize, but unfortunately failed to collect the bequest from Isaiah Morter because, according to the British courts, African redemption was deemed an illegal purpose. And this power struggle has ebbed and flowed, peaked and valleyed for 100 years now. Our brother, Third Assistant President General L. Emerson Guild, has been on the front lines in Belize for years, fighting for the UNIA because he knows that this is a crucial victory for black people all over the world. This is what's at stake. According to Brother Guild, our research shows 3 patches of land totaling some 500 acres in the Liberty Hall property. And we need to lay claim to the remaining pieces of the Isaiah Morter estate. Doing that requires more land and legal research and surveys to more precisely identify the properties. Isaiah Morton believed in the UNIA when no other wealthy black industry titan did, at least to the extent that they would endow us so generously. Now, let's pause for a moment. Most of you are like me. You've experienced the loss of a loved one. Someone who believed in you when it wasn't the most popular thing to do, and not just with words. They put their money where their mouth is. They invested in you because they knew that even if they weren't around, your vision was important and was worth supporting. So, and this may even relate to some of you personally, if your loved one left you something to help you with your dreams and the courts were standing in your way, you would never give up. Why not? I mean, in the time spent going back and forth in court, you could probably make that money yourself, right? Maybe, but it's not just about the money though, is it? It's more than a numbers thing. It's more than dollars and cents, right? There's almost a spiritual essence to the faith between family members. Certainly you want the assets because they have a certain market value. You're not naive. But what you're fighting for is the intrinsic value of a thing that represents the love and faith given to you by someone that you care about, who cared about you, and who believed in you when no one else did. Well, this is where the UNIA is. So now you're wondering, how can you get involved? How you can help? Family, I'm always grateful to share the mission of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, commissioned by the Honorable Marcus Mosiah Garvey with you. As First Assistant President General, it is my privilege to serve you through this association. I believe that the principles of racial pride, self-reliance, and universal African nationalism are the only path to liberation. Liberation firstly of our minds, and then of each other. But as joyous as the journey of liberation is, it is still a serious daily commitment. It's not just talk. It's not just a raised fist or an RPG flag. It is a commitment to the most honorable cause a person or a people can take up. So, what you can do is accept our invitation to you to join your UNIA family in this commitment. Your first step to getting involved is to formally join by applying on our website. The link is at the bottom of the screen. Then the work begins. By virtue of your African blood, you are already a member. You were born into this. But as we said before, knowing who you are to this organization is the first step. The next crucial step is to get active within the organization, bringing your skills and your passions and your ideas and your leadership and your stewardship. Search the link at the bottom of the screen. Go to our membership donate tab, apply for membership directly online. We'll contact you within a week or less. You inherited the association. Now, will you help to manage it? Will you be a stakeholder in the future that the UNIA is carving out? By virtue of your African blood, this association is your birthright. It is all of our inheritance. Take your inheritance. Africa for the Africans, from your brother and your friend. Peace.